about what that best method is.
Working in the Department of Anthropology, I work primarily as an ethnographer. Now, we use the term a little differently, I think, from other disciplines. For us, that means at the very minimum, you're living for 1 year in the community, you're working in the local language, and you're trying to experience as many different facets of community life in that area as possible. And until you've worked for a year, we try not, as it were, to write anything about that community. In fact, it's typically said that the first 6 months' work is thrown away because you're only just, in a sense, getting to know a group of people. The internet study is the most recent of my studies. I've actually been working on other projects, mainly to do with consumption. But I was interested in working on Trinidad for the internet because it seemed to me that there was a huge literature emerging about what the internet was supposed to be, and relatively little substantive studies about the consequences that the internet was having for people's lives. For example, there was the supposition that it was creating maybe a digital divide, so people in countries like Trinidad maybe had very little access compared to, say, people in Paris or New York. So my concern was to get back, as it were, onto what you might call the street, or particularly inside the private homes where people actually were using their computers, and see if I could get a sense of the grounded experience. What do people actually do? What consequence does it have for them? Now, if you're interested in knowing the consequences of a new media, you have to see everything else that goes on. If you look at, for example, people on chat lines where they're talking to others, does it actually create relationships that have meaning subsequently? I mean, as in this case, do we find people actually meeting, marrying, getting involved with people, which started on a chat line, but in order to understand where it goes, you have to know the offline life. What about all those people who don't use the internet? Why don't they use the internet? What kind of access do they have? What prevents them or constrains them? On the whole in anthropology, and contrary to some, I think, current fashions, we believe that the first work is always best done with people other than your own society. In other words, rather than thinking that the society you know best about is your own, we actually think it's the most difficult because you have so many assumptions about the way you do things. So much is taken for granted. So first, it's the strangeness, the realizing that people do things differently and you have to explain it. The second is the breadth, that you're trying to encounter people in as many different contexts and in as many different kind of other aspects of their lives as possible, so that the particular thing you're interested in gets understood within that broader context. And the third, I would have to say, is patience. Trinidad has a lower level of income, and people are more creative in finding ways of going online. They might be using the local cyber cafe, and for us that means hanging around in cyber cafes, being there enough times so we get a sense of what it's like to be there, looking at what the different uses people are making of it. One of the conclusions of our work was that there was a considerable amount of internet use, probably at that time greater use than there was actually in Britain, despite the fact that this is a much poorer country and has less access to IT than Britain has. The criticisms of ethnography are, of course, partly its own presumptions. It's trying to eliminate what you might call its prejudices, expectations, but one has to be clear that that isn't altogether possible. It's trying to pretend you can be in a kind of natural relationship with other people. But if it believes its own kind of hype, as it were, too much, it might forget the constraints upon that relationship. You are an other. There are effects of you being there. The people you're dealing with are often a relatively small group of people, because one of the advantages of ethnography of its depth, the way you get to know a few people very well, one of the disadvantages might be seen as breadth. A questionnaire might lead to hundreds and hundreds of people. Well, you can never have an ethnographic sense of hundreds of people. Even though you may be there for a whole year, nevertheless, getting to know people well means you're actually concentrating on relatively few people. So you're trying, in a sense, to learn what is the way to be with other people. What do they expect of you? What does an ordinary friend do? And then, to some extent, be the part. And if that means an excessive amount of going drinking, then I'm afraid that's what you have to do.
Like these researchers, this week you've undertaken your own research. You've been engaged, albeit in a preliminary way, in social science in action. As you know, this is a process involving pitfalls as well as pleasures. Your experience this week is a foundation for future research, but it will also enhance your capacity to evaluate the arguments and evidence of other social scientists. Your final job is TMA02. You'll need to reflect on the research you've undertaken and the data you've gathered, and to put it together in a coherent essay, linking it with some core information society themes, concepts, theories or debates. Good luck.